Professor Mazur. I think it was 2014.
2015, 2.5 years ago.
Times fly. You know, when I reviewed what happened since you have been here, I think the only way to describe what happened is a tsunami. We have a tsunami of technological developments that affect academic education tremendously. And I must say that you have been ahead of the curve. When you discussed the way you teach physics in Harvard, it was like you anticipated the changes that takes place these very days. I believe that universities are at a point in which they have to decide whether they should adapt changes, and discussions all over the globe. I'm on advisory committee of 3 universities, and in each one of them there is a heated discussion how much of the technological changes should be adopted. What happened in education is similar to what happened in medicine. There is a personalized medicine, and the future is personalized education. Adaptive learning, cognitive tutors, these are the terms, the buzzwords that you start to hear in this field. And I'm looking forward to hear your lecture 3 years later, and this will help us to adapt these changes for the benefit of the Technion. It is very interesting that, you know, university presidents are dreaming about ranking. Every president has his favorite ranking. There is the Shanghai ranking, there is the QES, there is the educational supplement of the Times of London. My favorite ranking is a recent ranking about 4 weeks ago. Which university prepare its students for the 4th industrial revolution, to the digital era? A miracle, Technion came #1 in the world. The British ranked us, mind you, the British. I must say that I don't know how to make an interpretation of it, because they have a similar ranking of employment satisfaction with graduates of universities, and we came #90. So there is a discrepancy between the 2 rankings. But somehow I believe that we are doing something right. And I recently said that whenever I meet Technion graduates, 10 years after they graduated from the Technion, and I ask them, in retrospect, what did the Technion give you? They say, they gave me the tools to solve problems that I didn't know exist. So we do something right, but we are looking forward to hear you to do it even better. Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you.
Shalom, and thank you for having me again here, for those wonderful and kind words. I have a fond memory of my visit to Israel 2.5 years ago, which was not my first. I've been here several times. Last time that I was here, I spoke about peer instruction, how to teach large classes interactively. And I also talked about assessment, which has to do with ranking, and you know how if we rank our students according to different criteria, you get 2 very different pictures. So I completely hear what you said. It's, you know, there is no good way of assessing along just one dimension any entity or any person. Today is going to be very different. I'm going to be talking for this first part, which should be a little bit shorter, about technology. And even though I love technology, I'm one of these people who will get up at 3 a.m. to order the latest iPhone before it sells out within 30 seconds. You know, I love technology. I'm rather skeptical about technology in education. Abigail at dinner last night was saying, how come you don't have a MOOC? Well, because the course that I'm teaching wouldn't lend itself to being ported over to the internet. Having said that, my first talk will actually be about technology, because yes, I do think that technology has a role, and as we just heard, we're at sort of the beginning of a transition to the fourth industrial revolution, where technology will play a very important role. In fact, already is playing an important role. So let me start sort of where I ended last time. Just out of curiosity, how many of you attended my talk 2.5 years ago? Okay. So a minority, but I assume that most of you are familiar with what I have been doing over the past, what is it? It was 1990, so 28 years. I've essentially been bashing the lecture as an outmoded approach to teaching that focuses on the transfer of information. And yes, I know I'm giving you a lecture now, but that's because I don't get to lecture in my own classroom, and I love lecturing, so I have to make up for that somehow. Well, in truth, I'm not trying to teach you something complicated, so this is not a classroom. Anyway, so in the past 28 years, I've replaced this process that you see on the screen there by an interactive approach to teaching. And I know that a number of you have adopted that technique in the classroom. Rather than teaching by telling, I teach by questioning. And yes, some students complain because they feel that I should be the one teaching and not they the ones learning. But unfortunately, I don't think it's possible just to teach by telling. So I've eliminated that process, and the question is, since the transfer of information is important in teaching, how do you do that? So what I've been talking about last time is that the traditional approach to teaching is typically a two-step process, right? In class, the professor gives the students the first exposure to the material, and then the students are sent home to their own rooms, and there they have to work on creating a deeper understanding of the material. If you ask yourself, which of these two parts is the hardest part, I think we'd all agree it's this part. It's kind of ironic that we spend our time as professors focusing on the easy part, giving the students the responsibility for the more difficult part. So what I started doing 28 years ago was sort of flipping this around. Have the students get the first exposure to the material on their own before coming to the class, and then in class work on building a deeper understanding. And the way I presented to you 2.5 years ago was basically by asking students a series of questions, having them talk to each other. In the second part, I will present a very different approach. And well, let me not anticipate what I'm going to talk. You'll discover it after the break. So before the break, I'll focus mostly on this. I'll say, let's not talk about making the class interact. Let's focus on the pre-class activity. And then in the second part, I'll talk about a different approach from the one I discussed 2.5 years ago about how to engage the students in the classroom and prepare them really for the 21st century workplace. So essentially, I've eliminated this. I've eliminated the lecturing. How can we effectively transfer information outside of the classroom? And I had already started recording my quote-unquote lectures back in the late 1980s. They were on VHS tapes and they were in the library. So when I started to think about that, I thought, why not have the students watch the recording of my lectures before class? However, I quickly realized that there were a number of problems with that. The first one is that the transfer pace of the information is set by the video. Let me explain what I mean by that. When you listen to somebody speak, like you listening to me speak right now, in a sense, your brain is held hostage by me. Let's say that I'm saying something that creates a cognitive dissonance. You're confused by it. And your mind starts drifting. You think, how does that work? Or does that make sense? Unfortunately, our brains are not capable of very effectively multitasking. So you either listen and process the incoming information, or you think. Unfortunately, in a class, if this were a class of physics or chemistry or engineering or anything else, you don't have the opportunity to really let your mind drift and think, because when you do that, you're no longer listening to the professor talk. Have you ever had in your class a student raise his or her hand and say, "Professor, could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think." It's never happened in my 36 years on the faculty at Harvard, but you have to admit, if you need to think, that would be the right thing to do. Right? So instead, what most students do is they may scribble a quick note, "I need to think about this later," or they just don't think at all. And there's therefore no time to process the information in a cognitively meaningful way. Now, in a video, you could, in principle, pause the video and think. You don't have to raise your hand and ask the professor to shut up. You can do it. But it turns out students do the opposite. Harvard is one of the founding members of edX. I've looked at the data. And the students actually turn up the speed at which the video is played back. My daughter, who was an undergraduate at Harvard, told me that she watched her lectures at 2.0 times the normal speed to get through it as quickly as they can, reducing the opportunities to think even further. There's a lot of research also that has shown for a long time, I think I showed some of those data 2.5 years ago, that anybody watching video turns into a meditative state. It becomes passive. I mean, this has been known for television watching for a long time. Why should people be more engaged watching a professor lecture about chemistry or engineering than watching television? The other thing, which is stunning from the data from edX and other online platforms, is that as the semester goes by, the attention tanks. So for the first lecture, the students will watch the full 20 minutes. For the first class, the students will watch the first 20 minutes. But then very quickly, they discover that they're not really held accountable for their watching the videotape. So, towards the end of the semester, they're barely watching. They're just skipping to the multiple choice question and Google the answers to the questions in order to, cheat and game the system. But most importantly, it's an isolated individual experience. The video, the students. Just as sitting in a classroom is, in a sense, an isolated individual experience. Yes, you're all sitting here together listening to me, but you're not talking to each other because there's no opportunity. So it's, in a sense, each of you individually listening and watching me. And the same thing happens with the video. Whereas I think deep down, education is a social activity. So by having students watching videos, what we're actually doing is moving this outside of the classroom so that we don't see it. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. So then I thought, we have books. Why not have them read books? There are a number of big advantages, right? When you read a book, you are in control of the transfer pace. If your mind starts drifting, you automatically stop reading because you can't read and think at the same time. And you can reread if you need to reread. Yes, occasionally we continue to read while our mind is drifting, but then very quickly we realize that we're not really reading, and our eyes go back and we pick it up again where we want. Also, there's plenty of research to show that the brain is much more actively engaged during reading than during watching. However, there are still two big problems. One is there's no real accountability. If I tell my students read chapter 22 before class next week, how do I know that they actually read and that they read in a meaningful way? And secondly, it's still an isolated individual experience, the student and the book, alone. What is it that we want? This is what we really want. We want every student prepared for every class, so that in class we don't have to just read the textbook to them and can do more meaningful activities. And we want that for every class, from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester. And I don't know about you, but ideally we want that without having to do more work, because we're already working hard. A few years ago, around the time that I was coming here, it suddenly hit me. You see, I'd put all of this effort in trying to make the classroom a more social interaction by having students debate the answers to questions among themselves in groups of 2 or 3. Suddenly I thought, I need to also turn the out-of-class component into a social interaction. So we developed a platform which is free and which is available in Hebrew too, although if you plan to use it, we need to talk briefly, called Perusal, with 2 L's rather than 1 L, with which we can actually guarantee every student prepared for every class. And currently all over the world we have something like 100,000 students using the platform on a daily basis. So it's a social learning platform. Students log in through their preferred social network, Facebook or Twitter or Google+, or they can log in through Moodle or whatever, learning management platform your school uses, Canvas or Blackboard, you name it. Or they can just make an account and log in. All of these are possibilities. And once you log in, it essentially looks like an e-reader. But it's not an e-reader. It's much more than just an e-reader. The first thing you'll notice when you get on is that you can see who else is currently reading that textbook in your class. And if you log in through Facebook or Twitter, it will preferentially team you up with people with whom you are friends or connected on Twitter or Facebook. And let's say that you read and there's something you don't understand. Well, you can highlight it, and as you highlight it, it opens a chat window that looks exactly like the chat window on your smartphone. And you can type something in. For example, no friction at all seems impossible. Is there some friction in any real case? I just make something up here, right? And as you hit return, the highlight sticks. And other students who are reading the book can see that highlight. So after a while, the page will be marked up. You'll see highlights. We can talk more about that later if you're interested, but I don't want to spend too much time on the technology. And if you click on any particular highlight, it shows a transcript of the chat between students that went on about that passage. Let me make this bigger so you can read it. I don't understand, says one student, how this combination of factors tells you anything about direction, blah, 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 and so forth. This was on October 20, just past midnight. 30 minutes later, another student here, with the initials SB, said, I think you may be able to think about the direction separately, blah, 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 blah. 2 days later, on October 22, a third student said, this is a great question. To further elaborate on this, we can think of it in terms of blah, 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 blah. So in a sense, you see here an asynchronous peer instruction between the students, helping each other understand the text. I beg pardon?
It's only per class?
It's only per class, so, right. So it limits the students within a class. So in Facebook, you have like buttons or smileys and so on. We don't have that. We have the question flag. So if the system identifies an annotation as a question, it will turn this on, orange. But if you think that's a good question, I also want to know the answer to that, you can click it and it increases the counter. And it, in a sidebar, it shows to other students, there are many students who want to know the answer to this question. Can you help? And if you really like an explanation that has been given by somebody, you can click this button, this helps me, and then that button turns green. And as other people turn that button on, the counter in front of it increases. And, students may benefit from just watching or reading, good answers that have been given to questions. So, there are other buttons. I won't go through this right now. What if you're not online? Let's say you pose a question, because I just said it's asynchronous, right? You don't have to be all reading at the same time. Suppose you have posted a question, or you flagged a question by somebody else to which you want to know the answer, and somebody answers it while you're in the coffee shop or eating dinner. Well, you'll get an email. This is an example of such an email. It reminds you of the question you asked 21 minutes ago. You asked this question on perusal, and then it quotes your question, and Brian just responded by saying this. You could ignore the email, but you can also interact straight from your email. You don't even have to go back into the browser. You can reply in the email, and it will magically strip the email of any, salutation, any signature quoted text, and insert that text as if you had been online in the chat. Or if you don't remember exactly where you posed the question, you want to see the context, you can click on this button and it jumps to your browser. Or you can say, yeah, this helps me, and click this button, which is the same as clicking that little checkbox. So the big question, so that's sort of, the big outline of how this platform works. There are many more details, but I don't want to get into that. Yes?
It could be complete rubbish.
But it's public rubbish.
Is it curated at all?
I was just going to get to that. But to give you one answer that I not plan on giving, if you put complete rubbish, it's public rubbish. So your classmates see it. Right? You make a fool of yourself. It's amazing how students police themselves into not having rubbish. Now they can, if it's plagiarized or if it's inappropriate, there is a flag, which I didn't show, which lets students flag things that are inappropriate to others. And then the instructor sees it. But it should not be curated by the instructor. But let me tell you a little bit more about how the system works, because I've not revealed the most exciting part of it yet. And then we'll revisit your question. Okay, so give me 2 more minutes, right? So here's the big question. How do you get students to participate, right? I mean, this is all fine and dandy, but how do I know that they will actually do this? Now, as I sort of alluded to in my talk on assessment 2.5 years ago, the more we can get students to participate because of intrinsic motivation, the better, right? We had a long discussion yesterday over dinner and this morning about, what makes Technion students different from other students, and, in terms of entrepreneurship, innovation. And I think part of that is probably that they're much more intrinsically motivated somehow, either by self-selection or anything else. I'm not sure. But ideally, we want students to be intrinsically motivated, not extrinsically. Right? However, I know, that even at Harvard, you can't count on intrinsic motivation. You have to have extrinsic motivation too. So we use a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation drivers. Let me start with the extrinsic one, which you as an instructor can turn off if you want to. And you can determine how big a role the extrinsic motivation parts. What is the extrinsic motivation? Well, it's a rubric-based assessment. When you participate in perusal as a student, you see, and you as an instructor can download it and then give it to the students, you see a rubric for their annotations. And this is partially an answer to your question. The students are told that they must demonstrate thoughtful reading and interpretation of the text in the body of the annotations that they post. So if all a student does is highlight text and say, I don't understand this, I don't understand this, I don't understand this, I don't understand this, you get 0 credit, because you can do that without reading. If you highlight something and you say, I don't understand this because on page 256 it says blah, 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 you get partial credit, because at least we know you're connecting the text to somewhere else. If you highlight something and you say, I don't understand this because on page 256 it says blah, 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 and I thought that, and you reveal your thinking and engage other students, you get full credit. We want a certain quantity of that. Just having one annotation is not enough. Typically, students will be required by the system to put somewhere between 10 and 20. You have, as an instructor, some leeway in determining that, but part of it is done by the system. Of course, if you put completely thoughtless annotations, that's fine too, but they won't just give you credit, right? So if one student says, I'm surprised by this, blah, 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 I think it's cool, however, and you reply, yes, that's cool, that won't hurt your score, but it will not improve your score either. And we want to encourage students to engage in conversations, so that's why it's fine to just, engage in chat. We want them to be on time before class. Now, it's very interesting to see that the students continue to use the system extensively after class, which makes sense, right? Because you want to continue that dialogue. And that tells you that the intrinsic part also works. Otherwise, they wouldn't continue to participate. And lastly, we wanted them to be distributed. You know what we found out in the beginning, the first few years that we pilot tested this? Students would annotate the first 2 pages of a 10-page reading assignment and then, call it done. No, they have to be distributed. Same thing as with video. You find that students watch the first few minutes and then skip towards the end to answer the questions. But now, because we can see where the annotations are, they're forced to distribute them through the text. In my class of 60 students, I get 20,000 annotations in one semester. 20,000. The students write more than the author of the book that they're reading. Okay? So I can already hear you think, how do you process all of that information? Didn't you just tell us that there would not be more work? And I wouldn't be standing here smiling if I didn't have an answer to that. You see, I work together with a colleague in the government department who is a quantitative social scientist. And actually, I say I work together. I bicycle together with him. We're bicycle buddies. And we both started our first companies at the same time. And he made a company that was able to quantitatively analyze posts on social media, in particular Twitter and Facebook, to do analysis of products or political events and other things. Essentially, he developed a machine learning algorithm to extract quantitative information out of short posts. And I was totally baffled by that as a scientist. I thought, how can you get accurate information? And he told me, look, humans are very good at accurately evaluating a small quantity of items, right? You could, for example, as a teacher, read, 5 or maybe 10, if you're very patient, 20 posts, think about it, and then decide whether or not that student has put in the effort you require in the reading. However, the mind is, not very enduring in the sense that none of us want to read 20,000. On the other hand, the computer is not as accurate as the human mind, but extremely patient and very happy to crunch 20,000 annotations. And if you compare large quantity with lower accuracy on a single item with high accuracy on a few items, you find that the machine actually wins out very quickly. With a few thousand posts, the machine will do a much better job than humans can do. So when I saw that, I thought, wow, these annotations are not that different from a post on social media. It's short, right? So can we adapt that machine learning algorithm to actually quantitatively analyze these annotations? And the answer is yes, we can. And here's my little caveat. If you're interested in using it in Hebrew, even though the platform supports Hebrew, we need to retrain the system to interpret Hebrew. So I would need someone's contribution, which would probably be only half a day of work, in manually grading 500 so that we can train the system in Hebrew. So if you're interested in using it and using this part of the platform, we need to work together. Okay, good. Good. So it's a specialized machine learning algorithm. It actually assesses intellectual content, but based on simple heuristic rules, right, by actually being trained by a human. And the great thing that we showed, the paper will come out soon, is that it actually exceeds intercoder reliability, right? So if we take two people, each grading 500 annotations by hand, and we compare them, because it's partially subjective, the agreement will be around 75%. However, if we were to take Daniel's training set, train the machine, and then have both Daniel and the machine grade another 500, the agreement will be around 80%. So it's as good as any human can do. So immediately afterwards, you have a gradebook. You can see for each student, you know, how many annotations, how many were on time, what the average quality is, and it's automatically connected to your learning management system. But it gets much better than that. This is the most exciting part. You see, when I was developing this, I was actually using my own textbook. Now imagine you write a book and then you get hundreds of students to read it and annotate it. Isn't that fantastic, right? It's so much more useful than having reviewers review your book. Because now you can see what is going on in the brains of the students. So before each class, I was just itching to look at what my students were thinking and what was going on in their minds. But you know, very quickly it became clear that it was an intractable task, because 20,000 annotations per semester, that's 1,000 annotations per class. I mean, you quickly run out of steam, right? Even though continuously I would go, oh, wow, that's what they're thinking, and you discover that your students misinterpret a word. You had meant something in one way, and you know, because they're not as used to the jargon, they interpret it a different way. You go, oh, I never realized that that's how they were thinking about the material. And you have that happen not only when it's your own text, but even when it's the text of one of your colleagues. So I thought, you know what? We need to develop another machine learning algorithm that extracts the main topics of confusion out of the text. It's not that hard, because you can see where questions cluster. So this is actually from a class not my class, this is a class at the University of Central Florida that uses a different physics textbook. And so you click on a button, and then it gives you the confusion report for that reading assignment. This reading assignment was chapter 24. And it tells you the 3 or 4 main topics of confusion, and it shows 3 exemplar questions for each topic. So you can see this was magnetism, the right-hand rule, direction of the magnetic field, the Earth's magnetic field. And look at this question. I'll read it to you. It's too small. Why is it that the magnetic field points away from the north pole of the Earth and towards the south pole? When on the previous page it stated the direction of the magnetic field is the direction that the north pole of a compass needle points. Very good question. The reason, in case you wonder, is that what we call the north pole is a magnetic south pole. And the book had not explained that, right? And this student had sort of realized that there was something funky going on. Something that a question in class, a student in class might not ask out of shyness or anything else, but here they do. Anyway, so I can walk into the class the next day and say, thank you for your great annotations. It seems that there are 3 topics of confusion from your annotations. 1, right-hand rule. I make a slide that has those words on them. I don't show this. I just have a slide. And I say, one of you asked, cut, paste. In fact, if you want to cut and paste, you just hit this little symbol here, and it puts it on the clipboard for you. Why is it that the magnetic field? I don't quote the student's name. You know, I leave it anonymous. I have seen instructors who actually will put, say, John asked yesterday, blah, blah, blah. But now imagine you're in the class, you've asked a question to which you want to know the answer. Nobody of the class has answered that question, and the professor is actually showing that question in class. You'll go, wow, he is reading our annotation, or she's reading our annotation. I only read 9, but they don't need to know that. It makes the class so much more useful. So what are the intrinsic and extrinsic motivations? One is it's a social interaction. The students interact with each other. It's fun. It's so much more fun to read the book together than reading it alone. Second, it makes the class more valuable both for the students and the instructor. Because rather than focusing on everything, I can zoom in on the most important problems in class. And then there's the extrinsic part, which is, the rubric-based assessment, but that's fully automatic. Let me show you some data. Those of you who followed my career know that I've always been very data-driven. On the vertical, the number of students in the class, up to 80% here. On the horizontal, the number of assignments that they've missed over the entire term. There were 17 chapters that they needed to read, but this is all zero, so I'm not showing it. Right? So, and these are 3 different semesters as we were fine-tuning the algorithm. So in the first semester, there was 1 or 2 students who missed 6 chapters out of 17. But in the latest year, no student missed more than 4. But look at this, missing 0. Every chapter of the 17 chapters annotated. 70%. I don't know about you, but I miss deadlines sometimes. I think we all do. And I think no matter what you do, even if you were to put a gun at the head of the students, there'd be some who wouldn't do because they're sick or they have another, there's some other emergency in their family, in their private life. They may have an exam in another course and not have time to read. So I find the 70% pretty amazing. And in fact, if you add the first 3 bin, allowing a few students to miss 1 or 2, you're close to 95%. I think that's as close as you can get to guaranteeing every student prepared for every class. So we can, of course, track the students' engagement. It's actually getting a lot better because we've accumulated so much data now that we can correlate. We haven't implemented this yet, but we're going to implement this in the fall. We can correlate students' behavior in terms of how they go through the text, where they click, and how they go from page to page with performance in class. So we can actually start to predict how a student will do based on their behavior online. And we're going to turn that into a feedback, completely without credit, but a feedback, telling them if you continue to just click on annotations without reading the text, you're not going to do that well in the class. So we can actually try to push them towards a behavior that is going to be more conducive to doing well in the class. That's the beauty of big data, right? We find that 85% annotate as they read. They can also just take notes. So you can highlight something and then open a chat window that is just for yourself. So it's not a chat. It's really an annotation. And this is the interesting thing. We can correlate performance in the class because we ask sometimes instructors to send us the grades of the students. We can correlate how they do in the class with their behavior online. Here's another thing, just as we were putting this platform online, there were articles in the New York Times and other media that said students do not like to read online. They prefer physical books. Well, my book is published by Pearson, and in order to permit the students access to the electronic copy of my book, Pearson required me to ask the students to buy a physical book. So in other words, the student had to show the book to me in order to get access to the electronic copy, show that they had bought or owned a copy of the book. And much to my surprise, I noticed that some students didn't even take the plastic wrap off the book. So at the end of the semester, I asked the students a survey. I said, when I study, I use the printed version, exclusively. I only go online to annotate. 2, I use the both equally. 3, I use the electronic version all the time and the book barely or not at all. There were really 5 gradations. I only told you 3 of it. This is what the students told me. They said, only 7% used just the book and not online, the opposite of what was in the press. And 88% barely or not at all used the book. Why? Because the electronic version offered more than the printed version, right? So it's clear you can eliminate books, right? And once we had that, we could convince Pearson to sell the book electronically through perusal at a much lower cost than the printed book, because it's like a subscription rather than buying the book and then being able to sell it. Because the students who fall in this category, they buy the book, they leave it shrink wrapped, and at the end of the semester they sell it to somebody else, and then the publisher and the author lose out. So you might as well eliminate printed books and bring the cost of books down significantly. So the current adoption process is you can either upload a PDF. So if you have a PDF from which you want to teach, you just upload a PDF and then you're done. If it's a commercial textbook, we need an agreement with the publisher in order to work it. We currently have agreements with most major publishers around the globe, in Europe, in the US, and so on. And then you just select the textbook, or you upload your own material. And then if it's a commercial textbook, then the students buy access to the textbook through perusal, otherwise it's free. And the textbook is also available on day one. The only thing you need to do is give a code for the course to your students, and it's there. So what are the benefits to the students? They actually read the book rather than buying the book and barely using it. More importantly, they learn how to read. Think about it. When we give our students their diplomas at the end of 4 years or 5 years, how long does it take here? 4, same as for us. That's not when learning stops. That's when learning really starts. But now they're on their own. We're not there to hold their hands and tell them what to do. They need to determine how they learn. How do you keep your knowledge current? Mostly by reading, maybe occasionally by watching a YouTube video, but I bet that you learn more from reading articles and books than you learn from watching YouTube video on how to, fix a tire on your bicycle. And you learn how to read critically, not just, with, one eye open and the other closed. You learn how to engage your brain in the reading and how to participate in a collaborative experience. So I think this really helps the students. Plus, it is a way for them to get more out of their classes, because in a way they're driving the class in the direction that is useful for them, rather than the instructor deciding what he or she is going to do in the class based on his or her experience. We are not necessarily the same as our students. And I think these are transferable skills, right? Because I find that even some of the students who've taken my introductory class with perusal keep this habit of reading in classes where it's not required, because they discover the benefit of it. And to the instructor, you recover time. You don't have to waste time, presenting parts of the book that the students can get on their own. You use class time in a more meaningful way. Also, I promise you that you'll get more respect for your students, because you discover that a lot of the difficulties are due to semantic misunderstandings that you were unaware of. I promise you that you go, oh, because language is fuzzy. And how we interpret language in our own discipline is set by years and years of experience, which your students do not have. And you may before have thought, oh, they're stupid. No, they're not. They just don't have the experience that you have. And you're unaware of it, but this makes you aware of it, because it's like looking into their brains. Okay, so, that's all I wanted to show of this. I'm happy to answer some questions, and I wanted to do this before my next talk, because my next talk will show what this platform has permitted me to do in the classroom. You had a question. I'm sorry, I let you wait a long time.
It's okay. I'm responsible for labs, and so I have a lot of manuals that we wrote together. And some of the students are first-year students, and sometimes the smart ones, they get out series we never saw and we never heard about. And they're they are learning it together, and there are many times they sit in groups, and then they get really something that you see why it's logical, but it's out of the world. It's not suitable to anything. Did it happen to you? I misunderstand it.
I see.
Theory,
Yes. Yes.
The basic theory of the
Yes.
thing we are doing to
Yes. Yes. And it will happen that when I go through the annotations, I see some students, I think, oh no, this is totally wrong. This is totally, completely wrong. And my fingers are itching to jump into the discussion. And in the first few years, I made that mistake. Bad mistake. Bad mistake for the following reason. If you as an instructor jump into the discussion, the students are going to become afraid of answering questions because they may say the wrong thing, and also students are not going to answer. They're going to, let's wait until Professor Mazur answers. So it kills the interaction. Now you may say that's terrible because now they're teaching each other wrong things. But you know, it happens anyway. So
and then they come a quiz and they don't.
It happens anyway. Now it's like
the quiz because everyone thinks the same, but everything is wrong.
the good thing is this exposes it, and there's a chance that you actually see it and you can address it in class. You can say, one of you said yesterday that blah 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 blah. Let's think about this. Does everybody agree with that statement? And if you have a group of, 20, 30, 40 students, there's likely to be one who says, I thought that blah, 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 and it starts a discussion, right? So at least it gives you an opportunity to uncover things that before that were mostly hidden because they appear, off your radar screen, and you can adjust it. Yes?
I just wanted to add that some of the backbones that I got in life was verbal mistakes.
Yeah, we always. I
I
love to
learning.
ask questions and to get the wrong answer. That's the best thing that can happen in a lesson.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, thank you. Great talk. My name is Dov Dori. I'm now developing for edX a course on model-based systems engineering with OPM, which I developed. And there is also a book that came out a couple of years ago of mine. I was wondering, does it make sense to combine edX with perusal, and how much effort does it take?
I mean, not very much, because this can be, if your learning management system is LTI compatible, then perusal is compatible with it, so you can just make it part of it. The edX platform is rather limited in terms of its tools. So, I wouldn't try to make perusal part of edX. In fact, we have a number of instructors who are using perusals together with edX. Yeah, but two parallel things. Yeah.
No interaction between them?
No, I've tried to set that up, and unfortunately, within the Harvard X platform, and we've gone to edX and asked for resources to try to incorporate it, but they're so focused on putting money into the development of new courses that there's very little resources available for developing new tools. Then you.
Have you tried this with graduate courses, and is there a difference?
Yes, so my colleague Gary King, who is the quantitative social scientist I mentioned, teaches only graduate courses, and he uses it in his graduate courses. He turned off the grading. So there's no evaluation, no quantitative evaluation of the annotations. He still looks at the confusion reports though, but his students never see what score they have for. Also, when the course gets too small, then some of these quantitative tools don't work as well.
Why did he turn off the device?
He thought that graduate students didn't need this extrinsic motivation. In other words, he doesn't lecture. His classes are mostly a discussion. You don't read before, you cannot participate in a discussion. And in a sense, that's already enough of a motivation for the students to do the reading. Otherwise, they come to class and they have no idea what is being discussed.
It doesn't have to be exclusive.
What
You
has
use the same system that you've developed
with videos. Because the
Oh,
video,
yes.
well, because the
Yes.
videos are
Yes.
running off PowerPoints.
Yes.
PowerPoints are PDF files. You can annotate those
Yes.
too.
Yes.
So actually exactly what you've done will work with the
Yes.
online videos. It will retain student interest in the videos. They will be watching them all the way to the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is awesome. Can
Absolutely.
I start tomorrow, please?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we have a very rudimentary video annotator, but you know,
No,
it's
no, on the PDF files. It will work. It's just as
oh, yeah. But even better, you could have a video annotator.
That would be a dream, but I'm saying it'd be good to have,
Yeah.
actually to have
Yeah,
an
no,
annotated
PDF,
PowerPoint.
that's easy. You
Yeah,
just,
that's done. You're there.
you can, any PDF, any HTML file, you just drag it to perusal and boom, it distributes it to your
So as I
students.
said, tomorrow.
You mentioned that you have a Hebrew version. Do you have a Chinese version as well?
Yes, we do.
Tell you why. We started to teach in China. You know, we have a branch now in Shantao. We have 220 students, and I met the teachers. I just came back. They don't ask questions.
Yeah.
The challenge is how to really trigger them to ask questions, and this system can really be a solution
Yes.
to the embarrassment to ask question in public.
Absolutely. So a year ago, I worked together with Beijing Normal University, which is their sort of flagship
Yeah.
university for training, in pedagogy and training teachers in the K-12 system and also in higher education. And so we started working there, and they started using it. However, I was just in Beijing a few months ago, and to my horror, I discovered that the Great Wall of China, the Internet Wall of China, is blocking perusal because it has Google, Facebook, and Twitter as a login option on the front page. So we're working on that right now, trying to permit logins through WeChat and China Weibo, Sina Weibo. So we hopefully will get that. We'll get past the firewall.
You should come to Shantao because
Yes.
we have cracks in the firewall.
Yes.
Are there signs of the students reflecting on their learning process? Even at the end of the course, for example?
Yes, unfortunately I took the remarks out. I had a slightly longer version of this talk originally, where I have some students who reflect back on their experience, and who basically state how that they end up spending 4 hours reading. And I thought first, oh boy, that's just amazing, right? That they spend so much time. It's time that they otherwise would probably spend on Facebook or other social media interacting with students. Now they spend it in the context of reading their book.
Wait.
For how much per week? 4 hours?
4 hours per reading assignment, and there are two. In some weeks there are two, not all weeks, but in some weeks there are two.
I was wondering, did you try this method in different faculties?
Yes, yeah. I mean, look, we have people in the faculty, and not just at Harvard. I mean, most of our users are outside of Harvard. At Ohio State University, which has really large classes, like 700 students. Okay.
Because I was wondering your type of students, because I teach design research methodologies, and most of my students are designers. And designers, it's very hard to read for them. They just scan. They always scan.
Right.
And
So we have some professors in the music department where they upload a musical score and have students annotate the musical score.
Mm-hmm.
There's no text at all.
Mm-hmm.
They just drag a rectangle over a passage or anything, and
just
then
need to speak the language of the students, like more
right.
images, maps.
Right, so I don't know, I mean, I could look in the user database to see if there's anybody in design, but I've
In
lost
design
track of it,
thinking,
frankly.
This is what I teach. I was wondering if it's successful in design thinking.
And in language instruction, we have surprisingly a lot of people who are in language instruction are using perusal. So, anyway, I hope that it sparks some interest. I suggest that we have a 5-minute break, and then I'll talk to you about how I implemented this philosophically in the context of an interactive course.